turn now to wealth and income. This is going to be more complicated. And what we're going to see here when it comes to wealth and income, right? So we already know from previous lecture video that that wealth and income are to be distributed according to what Rawls calls the difference principle. And so that what we're going to be looking at here under the heading of wealth and income is why people in the original position would accept the difference principle. And this is going to get complicated. There are two ways, and Rawls kind of goes through these two ways, but two ways of thinking about why people in the original position would accept the difference principle, would distribute wealth and income in that particular way. The two ways are the following. The first way is a kind of like what we just did with the principle of equal liberty. We just try to enter the heads of people in the original position, or we try to enter that frame of mind ourselves and imagine what we would be thinking when confronted with various alternatives, right? And just what would the thought process be? That's we kind of tell a story, something like that's the first way to think about or to see why people in the original position would accept the difference principle. And we'll do that in just a second. But the second way, which we're also going to cover, and it comes to the same thing. It's getting at the same kind of ideas. But the second way is more technical, and it involves this notion of maximin reasoning. And so we're going to examine what exactly that is, how it works, why people in the original position would use it. We'll do that. That's the more technical way of seeing how or why people in the original position would accept the difference principle. All right, so let's start with the first way, the kind of more just trying to enter the headspace of people in the original position, whatever. All right, so there's your people in the original position, and we're going to give them a bunch of alternatives, just like we had with the political liberties case. But now we're not worried about political liberties or rights or anything like that. We're worried about money, about wealth and income, about how those things are going to be distributed. That's why I have the cash over there on the y-axis. So the y-axis stands now for money or income, wealth, those kinds of things. And we're going to consider a bunch of alternatives now, right? Same way that we do with the principle of equal liberty, these people in the original position can consider all these various ways of distributing wealth and income. And so here's just a sampling of them, right? Here's some alternatives. Here's some different ways that wealth and income might be distributed. There you go. Which of those would people in the original position choose? Which would they opt for? Well, Rawls's idea here, the way to kind of get yourself into, okay, you're in the original position. We just did the stuff about the principle of equal liberty, about how rights and liberties are going to be distributed. And what we saw there was, well, the basic idea, because people in the original position have no idea who they are in some sense, no ideas about their particularities, no idea which group they're going to belong to. They're just going to kind of by default opt for equality because, they'd like more of these goods, but they don't know which group they're going to be in. So they wouldn't know which group to give more of the goods to. Because they don't know which group they're going to be in, if they take some away from one of the groups, well, that might end up being bad for them because they might be in that group. And so they kind of by default opt for equality. And so that's kind of where Rawls starts when it comes to wealth and income. I have no idea if I'm going to be 1, 2, 3, or 4. So why don't we just distribute wealth and income equally too? Why don't we insist upon equality, right? Everybody has an equal amount of money, an equal amount of wealth. And so the kind of default position, the plan B, if you will, the thing that they would just fall back on is society A, right? In society A, money and wealth and income is distributed equally. And Rawls's idea is that, look, if you distribute money equally like that, if you distribute wealth and income equally like that, people are going to have enough. People will have enough wealth and income to live just fine. to live, to further their own interests. They'll be happy. It's an adequate supply. They're good to go, right? And so society A with an equal distribution, that's going to be the default. And people in the original position would be happy with society A. Yeah, sure, fine. Yeah, I've got enough money. I can further my own interests. Good to go. But let's just look at the other possibilities just to be sure that society A is what we really want. Maybe there's something better. I don't know. We'll see. But society A is going to kind of be our benchmark. Society A is a good plan B to kind of have on the side. And if nothing else is any better, we'll go with society A. But we'll use society A as kind of like our benchmark, right? And so we'll draw that line of equality. If what that line represents is that if wealth and income were distributed equally, that's the amount that you'd have, right? That's the amount that each group would have. All right, well, let's look at society D then. Okay, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that society D is not particularly appealing. People in the original position, they know that wealth and income are very important for furthering your own interests. They're very useful for furthering your own interests, whatever your interests happen to be, right? That's kind of the idea behind social primary goods. They're useful for furthering your own interests, regardless of what your interests are. And so people in the original position know that. They know that wealth and income are useful, regardless of what it is you want to do. And so when they see a society like D, well, they're not going to be, they're not going to want to join that society. That's not going to be the society that they choose. Because look, just compare it to society A. Whichever group they do wind up in, 1, 2, 3, or 4, they're better off in society A than they are in society D. They have more money in society A than they would have in society D. And so they'd be better able to further their own interests were they in society A than if they were in society D. And so whichever way it comes out, we lift the veil and I'm in society 3, well, I'd rather be in society A than D. Or I'm in group 3, I should say. I'd rather be in society A than D. If I'm in group 2, I'd rather be in A than D, and so on, right? That's Rawls' idea. And so people in the original position are going to reject D. And that seems, okay, yeah, obviously, right? Okay. Well, what about society C now? There's some really wealthy groups in society C. That looks pretty nice. Wealthier than any other group in any other society that we're considering, right? All 3 of those groups, 2, 3, and 4 of society C are wealthier than any other group that we're going to consider, right? So that looks pretty good, you might think. Well, people in the original position are going to be very, very concerned about group 1 in society C, because they have no idea which group they're going to be in. They might be in group 1. And recall, they don't know the populations of these various groups. It could very well be the case that in society C, there are 10 people in group 4, 12 in group 3, 9 in group 2, and 99 billion in group 1. Right? That could be the way it works. Well, that'd be really bad. If that was how our society, if that was the particular circumstances of our society, I'd be basically, I'd be assured of being impoverished. I'd almost definitely be in group 1. The odds of mine not being in group 1 are exceedingly small. If there are 99 billion people in group 1 and just a couple dozen in the other groups. A few dozen, I should say, I guess. So people in the original position, but who knows? Maybe 99 billion people are in group 2. You have no idea if you're in the original position. So would you take the risk? Rawls is going to say no, they wouldn't. And the idea, it's a little bit subtle, but the idea is going to be something like this. The risk of being in group 1 there in society C is not worth the potential reward of perhaps being in group 2 or 3 or 4 in society C. And the reason it's not is because the less money you have, the more valuable it is to you, right? $1,000 for someone who makes $10,000 a year, an extra $1,000 is really, really valuable. They can do a lot with that. That extra $1,000 means a lot to them. An extra $1,000 to Jeff Bezos means just about nothing, right? You may as well use it as toilet paper. It does not mean anything to him, right? He could, I don't know, you see these statistics sometimes. I remember this was years ago with Bill Gates, back when he was the richest guy around. And it was something like, if he took time out of his day, so time away from earning money, to bend over and pick up $100 bill, he'd be losing money because he'd make more in those 10 seconds if he were to just keep working or keep being paid than if he were to bend over and pick up $100 or something like that with Bill Gates, right? And it's just insane, right? So $1,000 doesn't mean anything to these super wealthy people. It means a lot to people who are not wealthy. And so the same idea would apply here. Yeah, group 1, they're like halfway or so below the line, but that halfway, that little bit, that they're below the line, that means a lot to them. Way more than the extra money that you find in group 3 means to the people in group 3. Yeah. That's Rawls' idea. People would be happy with society A, with that equal distribution. If you fall below that distribution, especially if you fall below it significantly, like you kind of do in society C there with group 1, right? That means you're really hampering your ability to further your own interests, right? You're impoverished. Group 1 is impoverished, and they're not going to be able to further their own interests very effectively. And so for that reason, because that money means so much more to those people in group 1 than it does than the extra money means to people in groups 2, 3, or 4, people in the original position are going to reject society C. They'd rather have an equal distribution, because I might be in group 1, and if I'm in group 1, that's really bad. I don't want to risk it. The potential reward is not worth that risk. Right, that's the idea. And so the people in the original position would reject society C. They'd pick A over C, right? And so we still don't have a good reason to abandon equality quite yet. Well, now let's look at B, society B. There's an interesting fact about society B. Every group is above that line of equality. Interesting. What that means is that even if, right, so now I'll put myself in the position, I'll put myself in the original position. Even if I'm in the worst off group, which is group 3, even if I'm in group 3, the worst off group, the least advantaged group, I'll be better off than I was in society A. Well, that's pretty good. I'll be benefited by being in society B, even if I'm in the least advantaged group. I'll be benefited compared to strict equality, compared to society A, right? And so if I knew that I was going to be in group 3 somehow, right, that little bit of information was given to me behind the veil of ignorance, I knew I'm going to be in society 3, I'd go with society B, right? Because look, I got a little bit more money in society B, and money helps you further your own interests. And yeah, it's not maybe that important, that little bit of extra money, but it's still a little bit of extra money. And if someone were to say, well, look, yeah, but if you're in society B and you're in group 3, let's say, you're the least advantaged group. You gotta like spend all your days watching the people in group one drive around in I don't know, Maseratis. Is that a good car? I don't know. And wear silk shirts and scarves. I don't know. I don't know what rich people do, right? You got to spend all your days doing that. You know, you see these really rich people kind of doing their really rich things. Doesn't that just like get you? Doesn't that just, shouldn't they give that to you? What Rawls would say is, hey, people in the original position are mutually disinterested. They don't, fine. People in group one are doing really well. I don't care. I'm doing better. I'm concerned to further my own interests. I don't really care how the other people do. If they do great, well, fine, do great. I'm concerned to further my own interests. If they don't do great, well, I'm not going to. Another way to think about the mutual disinterest thing, they're neither malevolent nor benevolent. I'm not going to do anything to make sure that you get less, but I'm also not going to do anything to make sure you get more. And if you do get more, well, then good on you. I don't care, right? I'm concerned with my own interests. And if you have a silk scarf and you're whatever driving in your Maserati down the road, I don't really much care, right? That would be the mindset of people in the original position. And so they wouldn't have any in principle problem with inequality, right? Because they're mutually disinterested. And so people behind the veil of ignorance in the original position are going to choose society B over society A, because whichever group they're in, they're going to be better off. They're going to be able to further their own interests more effectively. And in particular, what Rawls is going to want to say is that the people in the original position are going to look at the least advantaged group. And the least advantaged group in society B benefits by introducing this inequality, right? And so people in the original position are going to choose society B over society A. They're going to choose a society that might have some inequality, but they'll choose it so long as the least advantaged are benefited by that inequality. They're not benefited as much as, you know, the people in group one are, that's for sure, but they're benefited nonetheless. That's what's important. And so people in the original position are going to choose society B precisely because they are in the original position, right? They don't know where they're going to be, but wherever they end up, they're going to be better off. Yeah. And in particular, what they're worried about is if they're the least advantaged group. And if they're the least advantaged group, they're still better off in society B than they were in A. But this is just to say, and hopefully this rings some bells from what we saw earlier, this is just to say that people in the original position would accept the difference principle. They would allow for inequalities so long as those inequalities lifted up, benefited the least advantaged, right? That's why they go with society B over society A. And so the idea is A would be their default, equality would be the default, but they'd go for B if they'd go for inequality if it raised up everybody. And Rawls thinks that does in fact happen. We talked about that last time. For example, allowing people with skills and talents and ambition and so on to be paid higher wages and things like that, to earn more money. That lifts everybody up. That's the kind of intuitive, tell a story, try to get in the head of the people in the original position way of understanding why people in the original position would accept the difference principle. Let's turn now to the kind of more technical, complicated way that Rawls addresses this. And this is one of the things that Rawls is actually really famous for, and it's kind of important. He's drawing on certain things in kind of decision theory, game theory stuff here. And theory of justice is discussed widely in those kinds of circles. It's famous for its use of those ideas in this context. Okay, so Rawls is going to say people in the so what's the basic idea? People in the original position use maximin reasoning. This is what Rawls says. This is the kind of reasoning that they're going to engage in, and because they engage in this kind of reasoning, that's why they're going to accept the difference principle. Okay, so how does this work? Let's slow down and go through it in detail. What on earth is maximin reasoning? So if you see that and you think, isn't that a typo? It's not. That's the word. It's a made-up word, maximin, right? It's made up out of, I trust that this is how it's made up. It's made up out of the words maximize and minimum. Maximize the minimum, the maximum minimum, maximin, right? Maximin. And to engage, what is maximin reasoning then? Well, it's when you rank alternatives, right? You have a series of alternatives before you, and you rank them, in terms of choice, like which one am I going to choose first, second, third, fourth, or whatever. You rank them by looking at the worst possible outcome in each alternative. You choose the alternative, in other words, with the best worst outcome. Well, that doesn't help it. What is the best worst outcome? What does that mean? Let's consider again a bunch of graphs, right? A, B, C, and D, those are our alternatives. And so if we're going to use maximin reasoning, what we're going to do is we're going to rank A, B, C, and D by the worst outcomes that they have. So what are their outcomes? Here they are, right? So again, I just make these up. So we're going to rank A, B, C, and D in terms of their worst outcome. So what that means is you can ignore all the other outcomes. All you have to do in each case is look for the worst one. And so look at A. What's the worst one? 4, right? That's the lowest, whatever, bar. That's the worst outcome. B, 1, right? That's the lowest bar. And C, it's going to be 1 again. And over in D, it's 3. When you're engaging in maximin reasoning, then all you're really concerned with are those outcomes. Those are the worst outcomes. I'll highlight them. The yellow bars, right, that I've just highlighted, those are the worst outcomes of the 4 alternatives that we have. Between A, B, and C, and D, we've now highlighted the worst outcomes of each alternative. And what maximin reasoning says is that you rank these alternatives, you rank A, B, C, and D in terms of their worst outcome. So the maximin ranking of these 4 alternatives, right, you look for which one has the best worst outcome. And that's very clearly C, right? You look at alternative C, group 1 there, that's the biggest yellow bar out there, right? We highlighted all the worst outcomes. What's the best one? What's the one that has the biggest yellow bar? That's C. And then in second place is going to come B, right? Because group 1 and B is not as big as group 1 and C, but group 1 and B is bigger than group 3 and D and bigger than group 4 and A. And so there's your ranking. Right? That's maximin reasoning. And so maximin reasoning would say choose C, alternative C. If you were using maximin reasoning, you'd choose alternative C here. Why? Because it has the best worst outcome. Its worst outcome is better than the worst outcome of any other alternative. Right? That's another way of thinking about it. Now, that's what maximin reasoning is. The question we want to consider, though, is why on earth would people in the original position reason like that? You might think, well, I don't know, that's kind of a neat thing, I guess. I'd never heard of that before. Now I've heard of that. Okay, fine. But if you think about it, that's a really bizarre way of reasoning that we don't typically engage in. For instance, let's say you're trying to figure out which restaurant to go to. And you say, oh, I just read some Rawls. I know how you're supposed to choose things. You do it with maximin reasoning, right? And so you start thinking, well, so what does that mean in terms of choosing a restaurant? Well, this is what we got to do. We got to look at the menus of each restaurant, and we got to figure out what the worst dish is at each restaurant. And then we choose the restaurant with the best worst dish. Well, that'd be an absurd way to choose a restaurant, right? You go to the restaurant, and the waiter asks, oh, why'd you come here? And you say, oh, because, the worst item on the menu was like passable. It's like fine. That's why we can't. Like what? No, that's ridiculous. That's not why you go to a right. You don't use maximin reasoning when you're thinking about which restaurant to go to, because you can just avoid the worst dish very easily, right? You just don't order it. Yeah. So why do people use maximin reasoning, this bizarre way of thinking, this bizarre way of reasoning? Why do they use it in the original position? Rawls gives three considerations, three reasons for why they would use it. The very general idea that all these considerations are in some way or another, if you spell them out, kind of getting at, but the very general idea that Rawls is working with here. You use maximin reasoning in situations of extreme uncertainty, when you really have no idea how likely things are, what exactly is going to happen. When you're faced with extreme uncertainty, but you have a little bit of knowledge of your alternatives, that's when maximin reasoning is going to be useful, when you should use it. And so in the case I was just giving about going to a restaurant, that's not a situation of extreme uncertainty, right? I know that I could just order the good dish on the menu and not order the bad one. They're not going to like make me eat the worst dish on the menu or whatever. And I know that, and I can just leave if they, for some reason, did, right? And so it's not it's not a position of having to make a choice in extreme uncertainty. Whereas the original position is, there's extreme uncertainty. You have no idea. You're behind the veil of ignorance. That's the uncertainty. You don't know about the particularities of your own society. Yeah. And you've got to make a choice with this kind of very limited information about alternatives. That's the very general idea. More specifically, Rawls gives these three reasons. In the original position, knowledge of the likelihood of alternatives is impossible. What does that mean? We've already seen what exactly it means. So just give you some graphs again. It's a point I've already talked about. Knowledge of the likelihood of alternatives impossible. Look at just alternative A. You have what this first point means, that the knowledge of the likelihood of alternatives is impossible. What it means is you have no idea how likely it is that you'll end up in group 4. You have no idea how likely it is that you'll end up in group 2 or 3 or 1 or any of the groups. You have no idea how likely it is that you'll end up in one of the groups. Yeah. Because if you did, you wouldn't use maximin reasoning, Rawls wants to say. You'd use probabilistic reasoning. But because the people are behind the veil of ignorance, and they're behind the veil of ignorance because we want to render the decisions fair and impartial. So because they're behind the veil of ignorance, they don't know about the particularities of their own society. And that's why they have no idea how many people are going to be in group 4 or group 2 or group 3. They have no idea how likely each of those alternatives is, right? And so in a scenario like that, your best bet, Rawls would say, is to use maximin reasoning, right? Avoid A, go for something like, let's see, what would it be? C, I guess, right? C's got the best worst case outcome. It's group 1 there. Go for that. You have no idea how likely the relevant outcomes are. Play it safe, because with C at least, you know you'll have an adequate supply wherever you end up, an adequate supply of whatever it is being distributed here. Second reason, in the original position, again, this is an idea we've kind of already seen. I've baked a lot of this into the my kind of presentation of the reasoning that these people engage in, that these people in the original position engage in. In the original position, people care very little for what might be gained beyond what an equal distribution would give them, right? So if we distributed income and wealth equally, you know, that's pretty good. People will be pretty happy with that. That's enough income and wealth to further my own interests and to do what I want to do. Anything beyond that is nice. That's, yeah, more money, I can further my interests even better. But it's not, you know, it's not that important. I don't care very much for it. I do care very much that I'm at least at that level of equality, because if I fall below that, well, now I'm seriously putting in danger my ability to further my own interests. And I care about that. That's like the one thing I care about in the original position. And so they care very much to at least be at that level of equality. They don't really care all that much to be substantially beyond it. And so what this is capturing is this idea that, people are going to be somewhat risk averse, right? They're going to insist at the very, they're going to be really looking at the best worst scenario, the best worst outcome. They're going to be using maximin reasoning, right? Something like that, because they don't care for getting a whole mint of money or taking a risk like that. And lastly, and somewhat relatedly, Rawls says the rejected alternatives have unacceptable outcomes. So let's just consider one rejected alternative, society A, right? That is not a society that people in the original position would accept. Let's say that's a distribution of money. I don't have anything on the y-axis there. Let's say I put a dollar bill there, yeah. Group 4, that outcome, unacceptable, right? If you wound up in that group, you would not be able to further your own interests. You would be severely limited in in your ability to further your own interests. That's unacceptable. Right? That'd be like dire poverty. That's not what we would. No, that's not okay. Right? That's an unacceptable outcome. And since I don't really care to, have $3 trillion, I care very much about not having one of these unacceptable outcomes, and I have no idea how likely each of these outcomes is. I'm going to use maximin reasoning. I'm going to maximize the minimum. I'm going to choose the alternative that has the best worst outcome, right? That's Rawls's idea. That's why we use maximin reasoning. Apply this idea now that we've seen maximin reasoning back to the choice of various societies. Yeah, in the original position. We got our people in the original position back, and they're trying to choose between these alternatives. What are they going to go with? Well, they're going to look at the best. They're going to look at the worst outcomes, right? And I've highlighted those for you. And they're going to rank these various societies in terms of the worst outcomes. They're going to choose the society with the best worst outcome. And what is that? Well, that's very clearly society B, right? So they're going to choose society B. They're going to reject D, C, and A. There you go, right? You get the same exact result as when we were kind of going through the kind of story, when we were going through their thought process, right? So maximum reasoning gives you the same result, which is just to say, it shows that people in the original position would accept the difference principle. Because people in the original position are choosing in a condition of extreme uncertainty, they're going to reason using maximin reasoning, and that's going to lead them to accept something like the difference principle. It's going to lead them to accept something like society B. Yeah? That's Rawls's idea. That's why people in the original position accept the difference principle, right? Much longer story to tell there, much more complicated.